another crappy production of Drawing with Trav. Today we're going to talk about composition. Now when I talk about composition, I love using the way Wucius Wong breaks up the elements of composition. This is from his book, Principles of Two-Dimensional Design. He breaks up the elements of composition into three different layers here. The practical elements, that's the overall intent of the drawing or the painting or whatever it is you're making as a piece of art. The big idea sort of thing. The visual and formal elements, now these are the things within that composition, the objects, the source material, whatever it is you're drawing or painting, that then tell the story. And then the relational elements are where and why you place them within there, in terms of direction, position, space, or gravity. Let's take a little closer look at some of these. Again, with the practical elements, this is the big idea, why you're making this drawing or painting at all. This is sort of what's going to drive all the decisions you make with the other elements of the composition. This can be in terms of representation. It's derived from nature, the man-made world. Maybe it has meaning. It conveys some sort of message. It can purely be a functional thing. It's a drawing that shows you how to put something together, you know. Or it can purely be formal. The piece of art exists just for the sake of existing. It doesn't always have to convey anything whatsoever. Let's talk about the visual/formal elements and what they can be. We can talk about those in terms of shape. We can talk about those in terms of size. We can talk about those in terms of color and also texture. What does that mean? First, let's start though with this picture plane. Want to know what the picture plane is? When I mention the picture plane, it's essentially that plane between you and whatever it is you're drawing. So for us, it's going to be the piece of paper we're working on, or maybe it's a piece of canvas, something like that. But it's that plane between you and whatever it is you're drawing. Now, when we start to put objects within the picture plane, like in Al Held's work here, we can start to tell a story by the objects themselves. It can be more formal and geometric like this. But the picture plane itself can be shaped and carved. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a rectangle or square, like in the work of Frank Stell and Elizabeth Murray. So think about that and how you tell the story you want to tell, if that makes sense. The proportion of the picture plane can also be important. Here you have a more cinematic proportion. The Damien Lee painting up here, it's more of a 16:9. Cinematic proportion does is it creates more, I guess, mystery. It's something we're used to seeing when we go to the movies. Here's kind of an old 4:3 computer screen proportion though, and it's a different feel. The figure's centered within the composition. It has just a different feel to it, based purely on the proportions of that composition. Yet one more thing to think about. Talk about size or scale. We've got the gigantic drawings here by Robert Longo, and they're set up high, so they're kind of intimidating, overlooking you. But it can be just as powerful to create small work, like in the work, these little portraits by Elizabeth Peyton. Bigger doesn't always mean better, you know. But you decide the story you want to tell based on scale and size. Within the picture plane itself, though, when the elements we put in there, we can play with scale and size. Here, this guy already looks like he's in trouble with this big building. Looks like it's about ready to fall on him. But the real trouble is this gigantic guy over here. So here, this comparison in scale. Either way, this guy's in a lot of trouble. Color. Here we have the bright, vibrant colors of Iago and Wayne Thiebaud. Seems like a real happy sort of positive vibe to these compositions. But in the work of Anselm Kiefer, who did a lot of work that dealt with the Holocaust, using more neutrals, a much more somber sort of feeling. So if you use color in your work, think about the message that color conveys. Texture. We have actual texture on the left with Julian Schnabel plastering the plates with Bondo to the surface, the substrate. And no matter what he paints over the top of it, it's always going to feel fragmented and broken up. And then you have the invented texture using a crayon or a colored pencil by Alexander Ross that convey yet another layer of meaning. And there's a lot of different textures out there that can create meaning, and using symbols and letters and words, and this is full of them. It's all about the story you ultimately want to tell. Let's talk about those relational elements in terms of direction and position, where you place things. In terms of space, thinking about the unoccupied space along with the occupied space. And the work by Lebbeus Woods here, just using line. I think the name of this work is actually Flow, but just using line to give a sense of flow through these drawings, a sense of movement through these drawings. Same thing with Dimitri's painting here, that pushing us up into the upper right here, that flow of pushing us that way, that movement, that direction. And then Drew's work, that one-point perspective funneling us down to possibility of a focal point happening here. This is all stuff you can use. Perspective is great in terms of dictating direction through a painting, pulling us down towards a focal point. This is another great example by David Schnell using perspective. Position. Rachel Howard was an assistant for Damien Hirst, who did a bunch of these big dot paintings, but in her work, she's just using one dot, and she's positioned it very specifically, having it kind of float as if it's being pulled up to that upper left. It was important for her. I don't know why, but it is pleasing in general in terms of where it is located. But you have to make those decisions of why you locate, what you locate, where you locate stuff in your composition. The work by Damien Hirst here. These are three crows. Looks like they've just been shot. He could have put them in the center of the composition. He could have put them on the bottom portion, but he's elevated them to the top of the composition, make them feel like they're floating above us. Maybe something more of a foreboding sort of feeling to the whole composition. Francis Bacon, self-portraits, these distorted self-portraits. Now he's playing more with the center of the composition, but I love the way he set off each figure with this black square. That's the thing that stays consistent in each one of these to help push these things forward. That's a compositional element that he's included, even though he's working with the center of the composition. You've probably heard about the rule of thirds, the idea that if you break the composition down in thirds, both horizontally and vertically, that the best or most pleasing to the eye would be to line up the elements of the composition along those lines, those thirds. So they would say this is a not so pleasing composition on the left, and this would be a more pleasing composition on the right. It's up to you. It's up to you, the story you want to tell. This might be just cocktail party stuff where you look impressive for your friends, because Wes Anderson, the filmmaker, is obsessed with the center of the composition. If you've ever seen The Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Royal Tenenbaums, Isle of Dogs, Life Aquatic, he is obsessed with the center of the composition, and that's where he places the majority of his elements, so he thinks the rule of thirds is butkus. Positioning yourself or the viewer within the composition. Those concept designers for film and gaming love to tilt the horizon like Daniel Dosu has done here and put us in this really odd positions, give us a feeling of uneasiness. Same here in the Feng Zhu, tilting that horizon line along here, putting us down lower in the composition so this thing is intimidating over the top of us. And then Daniel Dosu has put us way up in the air here as if we're weightless, we're falling down into this. So positioning the viewer within the work also is important. And then finally, space. Thinking about the occupied along with the unoccupied space, carving up that composition like in the Alison Strafella work here, which is actually just using a typewriter ribbon and I think a colon over and over again to make it feel like this piece has been pulled out, carving up this composition. Here's a more traditional positive negative composition, as if the center has been pulled out of here and thrown over here. In more representational way, using negative space, all these dark sort of timbers, creating a bit of a focal point here in the center. Same thing here. They create almost a framing sort of device in this composition. Same thing here in the Damien Lieb painting, using the figures in the foreground as a framing device for this focal point into the middle. And then Feng Zhu carving up his composition using the figures as negative space. And then finally, to create depth in this drawing by Ryan Church, he's carved up the picture plane with this dramatic foreground, futuristic city in negative, and this all in positive, creating great depth.